John Calvin and Martin Luther were inspiring leaders of the Reformation. And I want us to see how they didn't just talk about their faith. They didn't just write about their faith. They lived their faith. And these two individuals respected each other. John Calvin and Martin Luther never spoke in person, but John Calvin really respected Martin Luther and grew up being excited about what he was doing for the Protestant Reformation. To give you a time frame, John Calvin was only 8 years old when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, sparking the Reformation. When John Calvin was 25 years old when he wrote the first edition of the Institutes, Martin Luther was 51 years old. So Luther is a little bit older, but they lived during the same time. In fact, Calvin wrote Luther a letter encouraging him in his work and in his faith. And apparently Melanchthon, who was one of Luther's co-workers, got the letter and was going to give it to Luther, but Luther was in a crabby mood that day and didn't want to read the letter. But Calvin references Luther a few times in the Institutes in a good way, and this is one situation where he writes, "I do not deny that the Lord has sometimes at a later period raised up apostles, or at least evangelists, in their place, as has happened in our own day. For there was need for such persons to lead the church back from the rebellion of Antichrist." And in another letter, Calvin wrote about Luther, calling him a distinguished apostle of Christ, by whose ministry the light of the gospel has shone. So Calvin is complimenting Luther for being an apostle who is shining the light of the gospel during a challenging time. And I think we need to understand that Calvin and Luther were under threat of imprisonment, of execution, and death. They were literally risking their lives during this time of the Reformation because the Catholic Church was so large and so powerful, and a lot of the kings supported the Catholic Church and were going to stamp out anybody who resisted. But Calvin and Luther both understood that the gospel needed to come back. People needed to hear in their own language the good news that Jesus Christ lived and died and rose again and ascended to heaven. And they wanted the people of Europe at that time to hear what the scriptures were saying, to hear God's voice through the word instead of all these man-made traditions. And I think for us, we are in a different context. We have freedom of religion in the United States, but I believe the spirit of the Antichrist, anything or anyone that is pushing against the cause of Christ, is still at work. And for us, we're not really under threat of imprisonment or execution for believing in our Reformed faith. But I think two big things that the devil is doing is that he is making people apathetic. They don't care about faith. They're not thinking about their faith. They're not thinking about eternity. And the second is distraction. When we are sharing the good news of Jesus, I think a lot of people are just distracted. They're distracted by work. They're distracted by potentially family. They're distracted by their pleasure, by their entertainment. They don't want to really hear the good news of Jesus because their minds are so caught up. And I think those can be just as dangerous as some of the church members experienced back in the Reformation with this threat of physical violence. So just like back then, I hope that we as Reformed Christians shine the light of the gospel through our lives to people who need to be reconciled back to God, and that we can stand firm on Reformed theology, which stands firm on the Word of God.